The podcast you're about to listen to was taken from one of our live programs. If you don't already listen to Radio Maria Live, you can do so on DAB in selected regions of the United Kingdom or by downloading the app. Just search for Radio Maria Play. All the Radio Maria podcasts are conveniently stored on this app. We'd like to thank all our listeners who support us with monthly donations so that we can continue to be a Christian voice by your side. To find out more about becoming a monthly supporter, visit www.radiomariaengland.uk.
Good morning, you are listening to Radio Maria England, live from our London studio, and we have with us here, very excitingly, Sally Reid, who is an author and a poet, and the editor of the new book, 100 Great Catholic Poems, which has come out from Word on Fire. A very exciting book. It's not something that I feel like should be on every, Catholic bookcase, along with that biography of JP2 that everyone has. But I haven't actually heard of a book that's a compilation of Catholic poems. It feels like it's really filling a need. But I'll hand over to you, Sally, to give us some background on poetry and your thoughts on poetry and Catholicism.
Well, this is an exciting book because you're right. It really hasn't been done in this way before. There are lots of Christian anthologies of poetry, and I think there are a few Catholic anthologies which perhaps deal with a particular time period, like the 20th century or Victorian, etc. But Word on Fire wanted this to be, in their usual fashion, absolutely comprehensive and going right from the very beginning all the way through to the end of the 20th century, and to encompass as much as I possibly could get in there. So there are poets from 20 different countries. And, right from the very first poem is Mary's Magnificat. And that's the only piece of scripture, because obviously the Bible is full of poetry. And then it goes all the way through to, as I say, the end of the 20th century. So, and there is such a rich Catholic tradition in poetry because, as I always say, poetry is the language of God. That's the way he chooses to communicate with us, which is amazing. When you read the Psalms, you realise that, because God is ineffable and because there's so much that we don't understand about God, we constantly have recourse to metaphor to say that, Christ is a shepherd and God is a rock and a fortress. And that kind of language goes right from the very, very beginning, even before the beginning of Christianity. So poets naturally are in that tradition. Every poet, actually, even non-Catholic poets, are all in that tradition. And that's why poetry is so central to the faith. And this is a really lovely book, and it's just flying off the shelves. In fact, we're out of copies already. They're coming back in January. And I think there are several lovely things about it. One of which, if I may say, is that Word on Fire asked me to write a commentary for every single poem. And I think that is helpful because what the commentaries try and do is to contextualise each piece of poetry in terms of the historical context and even the personal context of the poet. Give you a bit of background, a bit of what the young people like to call tea, So you've got the poetry tea, and then you've also got a little bit of kind of looking at the language, looking at, if you get a poem like Gerard Manley Hopkins, which is just packed full of metaphor, which can be overwhelming. And to people that don't read poetry, they think, I have no idea what he's talking about. Just to be able to break it down, to make it clear what it's about, and to know sort of which lines to specially listen for, and kind of a way in. So it's a very big book because every poem has a little essay with it. And it's also a very beautiful book. I mean, they've produced it in their usual style in the most beautiful way. So the cover is just gorgeous, and it really does need to be on every Catholic bookshelf and every poetry lover's bookshelf, I would say.
I was wondering what actually is the image that's on the cover.
Yeah, it's a detail from Botticelli's Madonna of the Magnificat, which is that beautiful painting of Mary with Christ on her lap, and she's writing out the Magnificat with an angel guiding her hand. And they've taken a detail from that painting, so it's just her hand writing the Magnificat with Christ's hand just on top of her hand. Let me just have a look and check that's right. Yes, the baby's hand is just on top of his mum's wrist, and then the angel is kind of holding the paper for her. So it's a really beautiful cover and a very beautiful book.
Wonderful. right?
Yeah.
Do you want to tell us a bit more about its contents and?
Yeah, absolutely. So, gosh, well, for instance, many Catholics may have heard that the Divine Comedy is one of the most important pieces of Catholic literature, which is indeed is true. And what I like about this anthology as well is that take the Divine Comedy, which is an incredibly long poem and is indeed the greatest Catholic poem. And it's the kind of thing that, I did English at university, but it's the kind of thing that even I would think, oh, well, gosh, when am I going to ever read or understand anything about the Divine Comedy? Well, what we've done is we've taken the Divine Comedy is made up of cantos, which basically means kind of long poems. So, and it's split up into 3 sections. There's hell and there's purgatory and there's heaven. So we've taken parts of 2 cantos for each of those sections of hell, purgatory and heaven with a commentary. So if you read what I've written and what we've selected, you'll have a little potted version of the Divine Comedy, which I think is really useful for Catholics who don't speak Italian and perhaps, aren't that into poetry. It's supposed to kind of make it a little bit easier. We've got the very early poets like St. Ephrem and St. Clement of Alexandria, who wrote staggering poems that were very much written to teach the faith, but they're not at all dry. I mean, the one that St. Ephrem wrote is lovely actually for Advent, because it's about Mary. The bit that I've chosen is called Hymns on the Nativity of Christ in the Flesh. And there's this lovely, lovely stanza, which I just now want to locate, having thought about it. Here we go. It just says, "Your mother is a wonder. The Lord entered her and became a servant. The Word entered her and became silent within her. Thunder entered her, and his voice was still." I mean, it's just absolutely gorgeous. And these poems, they're kind of lost because this was written in Armenian. And it's been translated, but kind of in a fragmentary way. And there are bits of it on the internet. And the translation was very good, but it was kind of archaic. So what I did was I kind of spruced it up a bit, and made it more accessible. So I like to think that these things will be brought to a much wider audience than they were, previously. So I think it's really exciting.
Taking a bit of a broader view, lots of people don't like poetry. How do you approach poetry? You're a poet yourself. What got you into poetry? Why read poems?
I started to read and write poetry because, to me, I was an atheist. I'm a convert. So when I was first into poetry, I didn't believe in God. And poetry was my way of making sense of the world. If things were very difficult, I found that if I could find a poem that reflected something that I'd gone through, the poem would give it form and give it some beauty and make it understandable. And so I think that's really important. And one thing that's equally important is to say that I didn't at that point, and I still don't always understand everything about every single poem. And that's okay. I think that people have this idea that when they read a poem, they need to be able to understand everything instantly. And then if they don't, they're fearful and they just leave it alone. But poetry is a bit like music. It's not supposed to necessarily be processed in the way that we'd process a newspaper article. It's supposed to be processed through your mind unconsciously. You're supposed to kind of hear the sounds and hear the emotion and just let it run through you. You don't have to write an essay on it. I did. You don't. And there are many poems that I've had that kind of encounter with in my life, where I just simply adore the poem. But if somebody said, well, what exactly is it saying? I'd have to think really hard, actually. And of course, English is my field, so I can explain it. But it's fine if people just say, I don't know what it means, but I really, really like it because I love the rhythm. I love the language. I love what it evokes, because poetry just really has to evoke an emotion. It's like the smell of a flower or listening to Mozart. Nobody would expect you to critique Mozart's score, and it's really the same thing with a poem. And with Catholics, I think that the poetic tradition is so strong, and our liturgy is full of poetry, and the Liturgy of the Hours is really all poetry. And Thomas Merton, the famous convert and Cistercian monk who was also a poet, he said that if you don't understand poetry, then you can't understand the Bible. And when he taught in the seminary in the States, he actually started up a poetry class for his seminarians and made them read, Shakespeare and Christina Rossetti and all these kinds of poets, because he said, if you don't understand this, you're never going to be able to understand scripture. So it's
yeah. You could almost call the Bible 100 great Catholic poems, or 500 great Catholic poems.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Wonderful. Okay, and what makes a kind of a poem Catholic, I guess?
Well, this is something I wrote about at length in the introduction, because of course that's a very difficult thing. And Word on Fire made it easy for me in the sense that they said every poet in this book has to actually have been Catholic. So we don't have anybody who's wavering on the fence or anybody who's rejected the church. And that does make it easier because we know where we are. It's an anthology that's very faithful. And I think that's just useful. Of course, we had to make some very difficult decisions and cast some people out who were Anglican, but this is a kind of strictly Catholic book. And that gives us a very clear overview of Catholic history and literary history and mysticism and renewal, and it's really fascinating. But more than that, a Catholic poetry has some characteristics, like it's often very sensual and very physical, and that's because we're a very sensual and physical religion. Everything about going to mass, we literally take Christ in on our tongues. We have incense, we have candles. Like it is a very physical thing. So the poetry is very, very physical. And there are some great poems in here where there's a poet called Vittoria Colonna, who was a great friend of Michelangelo. And she said she was going to stop writing poetry because she felt it was too egocentric. But she said that she decided to carry on, but she wanted to use the nails from the cross as her pen and Christ's skin as her parchment and his blood as her ink. So there's this kind of visceral engagement between literature and the word. Which is really fascinating and which is just very, very Catholic.
Yeah, it does strike me that there's something about poetry which is you're trying to kind of make incarnate some universal experience. There's some couplet, whatever, that people say, which is poetry is what's so often felt but ne'er so well expressed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is something that seems to sort of very much resonate with the Christian tradition and the incarnation. And again, you talk in your introduction about the importance of the Eucharist in making a poem Catholic in a way. Is that sort of central way of approaching the world and understanding layers of meaning.
And expressing the inexpressible. I mean, that's what poems do, is that there's something wordless that we can't understand or some jumble that we can't make sense of. And it's the poem's job to speak that something that is just impossible to say. And also, I always say that, God is the poet and his poem is Jesus Christ, because he had to express himself in the world and himself is ineffable, but he gives us Jesus Christ. So Christ is the poem, if you
and
like.
the word.
Yeah, and the word. Yeah, exactly, literally, which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I feel like often we kind of get so used to the way we talk about Christ that we don't really stop and think about what does it mean that Jesus is the Word, is the Logos.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Because it is profoundly odd.
Yeah.
In many ways. Yeah. And I was wondering if, you think there's a link between Catholic poetry and something like Lectio Divina. Or, I mean, again, going back to this link between scripture and poetry is these being able to contemplate and see multiple levels of meaning.
Yeah, because every time you read a poem, you see something different in it, or you take something different away. It can drive you mad, actually. You think you've understood it, and then you read it again, you're like, oh my goodness, And I do think that these poems can be used in a devotional way, actually. Obviously they can never replace scripture, but if you want to have some quiet time, and especially like through Advent, if you want to kind of draw closer to Jesus and just have some lovely reading to kind of center your thoughts, then they do work in that way, and they kind of open up your mind to prayer, because I think that reading poetry and writing poetry, there's a very similar mindset to prayer. You have to be very open. So it feels the same in my mind when I pray, and when I'm dealing with poetry, there's a kind of a similar approach.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Another thing you sort of talked about a little bit in your introduction is the relationship between poetry and truth. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that? Yeah,
well, since the dawn of time, poets have been something more than just artists. They've actually been people who are prophets, that are sort of seers, who can sort of foresee the future or speak the truth to society. And in Ireland, the bards had that role, that they would kind of record history in verse form and present the truth to people. So there is this enormous sense of poets being the people who can see through the facade of things and actually get to the nub of what's going on in the world. And that's always been the case. And that's why poets are so important in society, and why when we, jeopardize poetry and when we marginalize it, then we really lose something. Because poets are supposed to be able to look at things for a long time and be the ones who are not held to account by any other organization. It's interesting, isn't it? Because these days, everything's so fast with social media, and people produce things so quickly that I wonder whether we're losing a bit of that, because poetry is actually very, very contemplative, and people don't tend to take the time that they used to with things.
Yeah. And again, I feel like you gain so much more from poetry by memorizing it. People often think that you almost need to get the point of a poem on first reading. And I wonder if something has been lost by losing a tradition of memorizing poetry.
Yeah.
And that some of the best value from poetry I think you can get is when you have memorized it and it comes to you at moments.
Yes.
When you need a way to express something.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you think that, like, if there is this relationship between poetry and truth, then, as someone who believes that the Catholic faith is the truth, maybe this is controversial way to put it, but do you think Catholics make better poets because of it?
Oh gosh, that's really tricky. I can't exactly say that, because obviously there are genius poets who weren't Catholic. But I will say this: there are so many poets who you read their work and you can find traces of Catholicism in their work, like Sylvia Plath. I mean, I'm a big Sylvia Plath fan, and she wasn't remotely formally religious, but if you look through her later work, it's strewn with references to Mary and the Eucharist. It's really amazing, actually, and you get that with a lot of poets, not simply with the Catholic faith, but even if they think that they're secular, there seem to be so many references to religion and to other things. And most poets, I think, would say that there is something kind of other that they're responding to. It's not just a man-made thing. I mean, poets talk about, this feeling that the inspiration comes from somewhere else. And, we'd say that that's the Holy Spirit. And poets who aren't Christian or whatever might say that, it's some other kind of pagan force, I don't know, or nature or whatever. But most poets, I think, that do feel that there's something else going on. Because when you write a good poem, it's inexplicable. It doesn't come from you. It really doesn't. There has to be something else. Which makes you realise how incredibly inspired Shakespeare was.
Yes.
Incredible.
Yeah. You mentioned you're a convert and you started writing poetry before you converted. I just started, I haven't actually finished your little book, Annunciation.
Oh, yeah.
And you mentioned that the Annunciation is something that's was a theme in your poetry before you became Catholic. I wonder what your perspective is on that as a kind of a non-Catholic poet before actually becoming Catholic. Yeah,
looking back on my early work is really difficult, actually, because I didn't mean to ever cause offence or anything, but I was writing a lot about the Annunciation, and of course there were lots of wrong things in what I was saying about it, because I was looking at the situation and thinking, what was the real story? How did Mary get pregnant? So in that sense, they're kind of heretical. But at the same time, they are actually still lovely poems. So I've had a very complicated relationship with my first 3 books for that reason, actually. And I need to reconcile myself with it, I think, because it's all part of my journey. And actually, if you look through my first couple of books, there are an astonishing number of references to the Virgin Mary. Like, it really is crazy. So I think even if I say something wrong, I think we have to look at it in the terms of all my literary output and my whole journey, and think, actually, well, that was just the beginning. That was like my Old Testament phase. That's the way I kind of look at it. Yeah, it's not a bad way of looking at it, actually.
Prefiguring, gradual revelation.
Gradual revelation. It is, yeah.
Right, I think now is a good time for a music break. This is Oceans by Hillsong United. Do you want to say a bit about why you chose this?
I just love it. I love Hillsong music, and I find it very inspiring and uplifting, and it's always been a favourite since I converted.
Wonderful.
You call me out upon the waters, the great unknown, where feet may fail, and there I find you in oceans deep, my faith will stand.
That was Oceans by Hillsong United, and that was one of the music requests of Sally Reid, our guest on today's Just Life, who is an author and a poet and editor of the new book 100 Great Catholic Poems. And we've been talking sort of more broadly about the relationship between Catholicism and poetry and truth and lots of wonderful things. Now we're going to zoom in on some of the poems from the book. Do you want to start us off, Sally?
Yeah, well, I hadn't intended to do this, but I was actually at St Patrick's in Soho last night, and they told me that yesterday was the feast of the English martyrs, and they had the relics of Edmund Campion and Robert Southwell, and Robert Southwell is in the anthology. He was a seriously gifted poet, apart from anything else, as well as being a very brave man. And there were so many of these young men, during Elizabethan times who went abroad to Rome and became Catholic priests and then came back to England at their peril and stayed in England, administering sacraments to Catholics in secret. And, they had to stay in hiding because they were being hunted down, basically. And Robert Southwell was staying in the house of Anne Howard, and soon enough they caught him and they took him to Tyburn, and he was tortured and hanged, drawn, and quartered. So it was a really, really awful death. And the poem that I've got in the anthology is called "The Burning Babe," and it's quite a famous poem. And it was written while he was in hiding, and it's set on a very, very cold winter's night. And which makes me think about today because it's so cold outside. But it was even more cold because it was snowing. And it's about the nativity. It's about seeing Christ as a baby. But like the best poetry, the images come thick and fast. And turns out that the baby is burning, and this burning is actually the passion. So if you like, it's about the nativity, but also about the death of Christ. It's about the nativity and the passion, which is really interesting. And it's full of metaphor and full of imagery. So through the poem, it'll say things like the tears, they should quench the flames, but the flames are needed because they're a furnace, and the furnace is being fueled by thorns, and love is the fire, and the smoke are sighs, and shame and scorn are the ashes of the fire. So there's lots and lots of metaphor going on here.
Wonderful.
Shall I read it?
Yes,
I
please.
think so. Right, okay. The Burning Babe by St Robert Southwell. As I, in hoary winter's night, stood shivering in the snow, surprised I was with sudden heat, which made my heart to glow. And lifting up a fearful eye, to view what fire was near, a pretty babe, all burning bright, did in the air appear, who, scorched with excessive heat, such floods of tears did shed, as though his floods should quench his flames, which with his tears were fed. Alas, quoth he, but newly born, in fiery heats I fry, yet none approach to warm their hearts, or feel my fire, but I. My faultless breast the furnace is, the fuel, wounding thorns. Love is the fire, and sighs the smoke, the ashes, shame and scorns. The fuel justice layeth on, and mercy blows the coals. The metal in this furnace wrought are men's defiled souls, for which, as now on fire I am to work them to their good, so will I melt into a bath, to wash them in my blood. With this he vanished out of sight, and swiftly shrunk away. And straight I called unto mind that it was Christmas Day.
Beautiful.
Yeah, isn't it just absolutely amazing? And you can imagine this priest kind of going outside in the middle of the night because he couldn't go out during the daytime in all of that snow, and kind of having this incredible poetic inspiration, this kind of encounter with the baby Jesus. It's just amazing. And it's amazing what these men did, considering that they were probably terrified,
Yeah, I wonder if you think persecution does make for great poets in some ways as well.
Well, funnily enough, I've also got St. John of the Cross in here, and he was a Spanish Carmelite reformer, and he was literally kidnapped by his fellow monks and locked away and tortured and beaten and not fed and just treated appallingly badly. And he wrote, some of the greatest poetry in the Spanish language, during his captivity, which is just incredible. And the poetry is so beautiful, and it's love poetry. And you just can't, well, it's obviously something divine. There's divine kind of inspiration there. There does seem to be something about the more people are going through terrible times, the better the poetry is. And there's also like a really lovely section that runs through the Second World War in the book. And again, the poetry written in the most horrendous circumstances. We've got one from Edith Stein, who was killed in the concentration camps, and Dr. Nagai, who was there in Nagasaki, and yet they managed to produce such beautiful pieces of literature.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but if poetry itself kind of has a pattern of the Christian story, in that it's so incarnational, that there's something of the pattern of the suffering, and the story of Christianity almost matches up to the way that we think about poetry, and the way that suffering can bring about such great good. And I don't know. No,
I think you're right. I think that there's always suffering. Usually, I should say, suffering that goes into the writing of a poem, because it's kind of suffering resolved in a sense, and in a way that's what Christ is, isn't it? It's kind of terrible suffering that's then resolved in the resurrection. So there's a mirror image there somewhere. I think that could be somebody's thesis.
Yes, if any English undergrads out there, you can have this one for free. Right. Do you want to take us through another of the poems?
Yeah. Well, I thought I'd hop along to Gerard Manley Hopkins, who, for my money, is probably the best English language Catholic poet.
Yes,
I suppose that's contentious, but lots of people agree. And it's interesting because his poems are so densely packed, and they're so linguistically alive. He really was the first modernist, and his rhythms are so kind of irregular, and he uses he invents words and kind of uses grammar in strange ways, and it's all about the music. And there are so many images that I think people do get overwhelmed, which is why it's really important to treat this like music and let it all wash over you, and not to worry too much. And just it's a kind of poem you must read it aloud. I mean, he said that himself. His poetry was written to be read aloud, and with that, perhaps we'll talk more about him in a minute, but shall I read the poem?
Yes, please.
This is God's Grandeur by Gerard Manley Hopkins. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil crushed. Why do men then now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights of the black west went, oh, morning, at the brown-pink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with, bright wings.
Oh, I feel like sometimes when you listen to Italian or French and you think they're such melodic languages and you sort of woe the fact that you speak English, but when someone reads a Gerard Manley Hopkins poem, it's like English language becomes something very melodic, and like you could just drink it in, the sounds and the you almost wouldn't need to, it could be nonsense poetry and it would still give you chills almost.
And there's, in view of the fact we're having COP28 at the moment, and the speech by King Charles about the environment. And this is such an environmental poem, and it really shows the connection between the environment and God. And I love that line about the soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And it's how we've lost touch with the earth. Because we're always, we don't walk barefoot. Yeah, we don't walk barefoot in the fields. We don't let fields go through their cycles of rejuvenation that they need between crops. And well, I'm not a farmer. I really shouldn't talk. But I hear that that there are some agricultural practices that aren't great. I'm sure that's not the case with all farmers. And yet, for all of that, the sort of the second part of this sonnet, and for all this, nature is never spent. And there's that great line, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And it's how the world is so resilient and how it will never cast God off, because it's made in God. And in a sense, it's holy because of that. Like it knows its vocation. I mean, Hopkins wrote about that in As Kingfishers Catch Fire as well, that nature knows what it's supposed to do. And that's its holiness. It does what it's supposed to do. And that's the job of each one of us, is that we spend our lifetimes puzzling out what we're supposed to do. Whereas a kingfisher knows that it's supposed to just look gorgeous and do what it's supposed to do, whatever kingfishers do.
Do you want to tell us a bit about Gerard Manley Hopkins?
Yeah, he's interesting because he's another convert. In fact, an enormous number of the poets in the book are converts. And he actually converted under Cardinal Newman. And when he joined the Jesuits, he was already a budding poet, but he burned all of his poems. And this is common to a number of poets in the book who feel that when they converted, they thought, should I write poetry anymore? Which sounds really strange, but I think they thought it was too egocentric. It was too much about them, too much about wanting to succeed or kind of get attention or fame. So he didn't write for, I think, about 7 years. And then he was in Wales and he began to write, and his spiritual director encouraged him to go on. And then in one summer, he wrote these amazing sonnets called the Bright Sonnets. And that's God's Grandeur is one of the Bright Sonnets. And they're really his absolute masterpieces. These sonnets that are just so much full of the natural world. And old Gerard, he was quite a melancholic person. And he ended up going to Ireland, and he didn't really want to be there. He felt like a fish out of water and became quite sort of depressed. And he died at the age of 44, which is tragically young. But he's certainly a poetic genius. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. It strikes me, you mentioned lots of the poets wanted to burn their poetry. I think it's a similar theme in a lot of different art forms, is navigating ego and the intrinsic good of art and how you separate the two. Because it is quite difficult when you get very good at something and you get a lot of praise for it.
Yes.
To tread that line. Slight tangent, but I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, when I converted, I stopped writing poetry, and I wasn't sure that I should. And I really interrogated it, and for all of my writing, actually, like I was really like, well, does this really have to be about me? Should I really carry on writing? And I think it is a very difficult thing. And Thomas Merton, was another one who thought that perhaps he should stop writing and was encouraged to continue. And thank goodness he did. This is the main thing. It seems so funny now because with Thomas Merton, with Gerard Manley Hopkins, we've got this amazing work, and think if they hadn't done that.
Yeah.
So I think that, like with Vittorio Colonna, talking about wanting to write on Christ's skin and use his blood as ink. That's the spirit. Carry on and bring Christ into the world with your talent. Then that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And of course, if it's different if it's all about you. But if it's all about you, even if you don't believe in God, and even if you're not a religious poet, it's always going to be bad. Because actually, good poetry is all about forgetting the ego. There is a kind of a work of almost like a little pilgrimage to go on as a poet, that you have to let go of your ego and somehow let the work take over.
I wonder if that's maybe part of the reason why there's such a connection between poetry and prayer.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite true. I did some work a while ago about the Dark Night of Sylvia Plath, and how she and other poets by extension have to go through a period of purification and illumination and then possible union. And it's like it's like you are going towards something with your language, because poetry as well is all about casting off. It's all about not using lots of words. I know that it sounds like a lot of words when I read it out now, but actually that it's incredibly compact, because you're taking out all of the unnecessary words with poetry. You have to be very, very austere with your language.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on.
Wonderful. I think it's time for our second music break. This is Nada Te Tobe. Do you want to say a bit about this?
Again, I just absolutely love it. I mean, the words are by Teresa of Avila, who's in the book, and she wrote amazing poems. And I love the melody of this. It's just really beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. That was Nada Te Tobe, which is sung by Teze. And you are listening to Just Life this Saturday morning, live from our London studio with Sally Reid, author and poet, and editor of the new book from Word on Fire, 100 Great Catholic Poems. And now Tom here in the studio has a question for you.
Yeah, sure. I was just thinking, for listeners who have been inspired by this interview and aren't so familiar with the depth of poetry as yourself, and how would you advise them to get into poetry? Where would they start finding something that's suitable for them, and where their passion will lie?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think, it sounds like I'm just trying to sell the book, but I do think this is a good one to start with, because, as I say, every poem comes with a bit of explanation and a bit of historical context. And it's always helpful to have someone say to you, this is what the poem's about, before you even begin, because it just orientates you. So you're not coming in cold to it rather. So that's the first thing, is read the commentary in the book. And then in terms of poets to go to, I would suggest G.K. Chesterton, who wrote The Donkey, which is a famous poem of his, and also The House of Christmas. They're both in the book, and they're both I'd say accessible in the sense that they're just very beautiful to read aloud, and they rhyme, and they've got a great rhythm, and it's fairly easy to know what he's talking about. So I'd say G.K. Chesterton, great place to start. And going through, let me think, what else would be a good poet? Oh yeah, Oscar Wilde. Yeah, Oscar Wilde's great. There's the Ballad of Reading Gaol in here. And that's a fantastic one, and it really just tells a story. A ballad usually does tell a story, and that's what this one does. So there are some poems which are pretty accessible, so that's what I would do. And then the next thing is, don't worry if you don't understand something. I mean, that's very, very important. Allow yourself just to enjoy the music of somebody like Gerard Manley Hopkins. Listen to all the rhythms and the words it uses, which are quite sort of strange and shocking to the ear, but should be just enjoyable.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant, thank you.
Hi Sally, thanks so much for a great programme so far. I wondered, first of all, whether was there a period in time where poetry had a greater centrality in everyday life? And because it seems to me that perhaps there is, and poetry, unfortunately, has become to some people a little bit niche, although you're doing great work putting it back in the centre. Or are the sort of the sort of pop singers, are they the poets of our day? And is there any sort of popular artist whose lyrics you think that actually there's a real poet there, perhaps that your daughter introduces you to?
Actually, yeah, it's true. I mean, of course, there's Leonard Cohen, who's a brilliant poet, and Bob Dylan, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, didn't he? As well. Mm-hmm. So yes, I mean, pop songs can definitely be poetry, and my daughter loves My Chemical Romance, and I've seen some of their lyrics, and actually they are really good. So yes, certainly. However, that doesn't replace poetry, because it's different. Song lyrics are different to poetry. There's poems have to provide their own music. Song lyrics have to be a lot more simple because they're going with an accompaniment. So there is a subtle difference. There's a poem in the book which is called Quia Amore Languio, which is Latin, but it means "For I faint with love," and that's from the Song of Solomon. And that poem which is in English in the book, even though the title's in Latin. That was in the 15th century, and it was a hit. Which means that it just went everywhere. Everybody was reciting it. So we have lost that centrality because, and I guess that's understandable. Even with visual art, it used to be that in Victorian times people would queue up to look at the latest Pre-Raphaelite painting when it was exhibited, and we can't imagine that now, really, can we? In the same way, because media has just changed so much. So yeah, I think that if you look at the medieval period, poetry had a particular vibrancy that definitely changed with the Enlightenment and post-Reformation. Suddenly, people were writing much less Marian poetry, and it took a while for that to come back again. But if you look at the whole 2,000 years, it's amazing that you see not only persecution and things dying down, you see them come back. And that's really exciting. And I think that women's poetry, I was very interested as a woman poet to see how in the very beginning and through medieval times, you get some astonishing women poets like Hildegard of Bingen and Mechthild of Magdeburg and Hadowich, all these strange medieval women who were writing poetry like you wouldn't believe, and they get, in this English language anthology, they get kind of crushed through the Reformation. But then slowly it comes back in the 20th century, slowly. And I think that in the 21st century, we're going to see a lot more Catholic women poets who are good poets.
Thank you.
Wonderful. We've got a comment rather than a question from Elizabeth. She has sent a quote. "Poetry is like music. It gets under your skin before you have time to protect yourself against it, and it changes you." That's from Anne Michaels, who's a Canadian poet. She says, in support of not having to understand poetry, as with scripture, it speaks different things to different people.
Yeah. I like Anne Michaels. She's a great poet. Yeah.
I was wondering, another question, do you have a favourite contemporary Catholic poet? Apart from yourself.
Interesting. Actually, yeah, I do. So there's a poet who's called Father Paul Murray, and he's a Dominican priest who lives in Rome, and he's published a book with Word on Fire called Light at the Torn Horizon. And he's got other poetry books. And his poems, actually going back to the first question about what I should do if I don't really understand poetry and if it's new to me, he's a good one to begin with. Because his poems are very, very, very simple, but very profound, and often quite short. And I would really recommend him. They're beautiful poems, and they're very consoling. They're very deep and very spiritual. So him, there are other Catholic poets writing. There's a man called James Matthew Wilson in the States, who's a wonderful poet. His poems are very formal. So if you like poems that rhyme and have got an obvious kind of structure, he's a good one to go to. And his poems are, again, very deep, in a different way, but very deep and very, very enriching, I would say. Yeah.
If someone wants to sort of get into writing poetry, how would they start? Do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, well, the best thing to do if you want to write is to read. That's very, very important. So if you feel drawn to start writing poetry, read the greats and read the old poems, but also read contemporary poetry and just have a look at lots of different things, and read to get a sense of how poetry sounds, because it's a bit like writing music. You've got to kind of have an ear for it, especially if you're not going to be writing in form like a sonnet. If you're going to be writing free verse, you've got to be able to understand which sounds you're trying to get and what sounds right and what doesn't sound right. And that's quite an art. And then I would say get with a group of people who are writing as well, because it's really important to have feedback. And there are lots of poetry groups around, and there's the Poetry School in London. And years ago, as a young poet, I went to the Arvin Foundation a couple of times, and those are residential things set up by Ted Hughes where you can stay for a few nights and have kind of tuition from published poets. Yeah, it's important to have a community so that you've got people that will read and give you an intelligent and sensitive take on what you've written.
Wonderful. And I feel like this is also sometimes a contentious question. defining what good and bad art is something that drives people slightly crazy. But I wonder if you have a take, like, what is it that makes a good poem and what is it that makes a bad poem?
Yeah, this is a complicated issue, and somebody asked the same thing to me last night when I gave a talk. Right. Gosh, good poetry has to be incredibly economical, because it's all about the economy of the language. It mustn't be wordy. It's got to be 100% original, so no cliche, absolutely no cliche, no easy sentiment. That's just something that's incredibly hard to do. Is if you want to write a poem about your dead dog, it's going to be very difficult to avoid easy sentiment. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe easy sentiment's what you want, but if you want that, then go to the card shop and get a Hallmark card, So it's about digging and digging and digging and getting at something that's beyond the immediately obvious, because you're digging to a deeper truth, especially in Catholic poetry. You're dealing with spiritual truths as well. And also, this is what people who write poetry and are new to it sometimes fail to see, is that even though you've got to be aware of tradition, you've also got to be writing in the contemporary world, and you're in a living tradition. And it's no good kind of trying to sound like John Keats, because that day has gone. Art constantly reinvents itself.
Wonderful. Another question. Some people would potentially, I guess, take issue with having too much biography of the poets. And I mean, you have this idea of death of the author. Why do you think that the actual personal faith of the poets matter in going into a Catholic poem?
Yeah, well, this is an interesting one too. This was really Word on Fire, who gave me a very specific remit, and they said, we need people who are faithful. We want this to be a book where this is really, really a Catholic book, and that the poems are very Catholic, and so are the poets. And in fact, this is why we didn't go into the business of having living poets, because we didn't want people to perhaps be included and then go on to just leave the church. So, that's the publisher's decision. And although I found it, to begin with, I thought that would be challenging, I think it was wise, because what we've got is a very Catholic book, and it's something that can be used for sort of devotional purposes as well. And in terms of biography, the author is dead, etc. But I took advice from my daughter, who likes My Chemical Romance, when I was doing the commentaries, and I said, what should I write in a commentary about a poem? What would you want to know? And she said, give them the tea, give them the gossip about the poet's life and the historical context. And so that's what I went with.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been a real delight to have you with us. If you've just tuned in, we've been talking to Sally Reid about poetry and her new book, 100 Catholic Poems, that she's edited. Don't worry if you've just tuned in that you've missed it, because this will go up as a podcast. But thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's been a pleasure.